Welcome to Savage Minds. Today I'm joined by Professor Glenn Lowry, the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University. He has written extensively about race and inequality in the United States. Welcome to our show.
I have been following you for many months. It all started when Adolph Reed no-platformed from the DSA in Philadelphia and New York this spring over his article that he wrote for, I believe it was Common Dreams. I don't know if you followed this debate, but
I did not. And who are you speaking of again?
Adolph Reed.
Oh, Adolph Reed. Adolph Reed.
Yes.
I didn't know he had been deplatformed. Oh, I guess I did catch wind of this somehow.
Yes.
He was raising questions about whether to frame the inequality issues in terms of identity and race was the right thing to do. Am I correct?
Well, there were two issues. Yes, it was that. It was about class. And he, of course, makes the argument that class is where we need to be focused on the left, and that race becomes part of a larger, I'm paraphrasing here, but he does discuss racist essentialism. And also in terms of an alleged study, again, back at the beginning of COVID, there was a lot of media mechanisms in place on the pseudo-left, the neoliberal media, that was trying to make out that there was some kind of genetic link between being African American and having higher rates of COVID, with absolutely no discussion about socioeconomics, nothing. And he rightfully pointed this out as problematic in the Common Dreams piece he wrote. He was deplatformed, and I was like alarmed because this seemed to signal to me a much larger problem of race essentialism that's been on the left for many years. Or again, when I say the left, we've got to put quotes around that, because what left are we talking about? But the neoliberal CNN watching, maybe, even further left of that left, where people have been promoting the idea of racial essentialism. I still am very upset by some of the essentialism that I've seen in some of the Black Lives Matter. Media takes that entire ethos, if we can call it an ethos, also similarly raises alarms of race essentialism that concern me. So when I came across your talks online and many dialogues you've had with other scholars, I was very impressed, because I was like, finally, we can talk coherently about a problem, or about a series of problems, without oversimplifying everything, because I think that's also happening. And I was, wondering, when you've spoken a lot about, in recent weeks, about Daniel Patrick Moynihan's report, The Negro Family, the case for national action, and some of the problems that Moynihan faced back in the day when he was called a racist for pointing out certain problems about single parent households, to today, where pointing out anything, even on the basis of science or social science, becomes almost this dance of, is the person brave enough to discuss this, or do we shy away and pretend that nothing matters? It's almost as if speaking about social sciences today and other even sciences becomes a matter of being brave enough to fight the various labels that might come one's way. Even being called conservative. Sure, you've been called conservative for things that you've said that are in a rationalization of what is being said is simply a discussion. So everything's been so politicized, Glenn. And one thing I really like is you speak truth to some of this nonsense. And we're living in a period of time where the left and right have shifted, where I'm seeing the left coming out with these racialisms that I just can't make heads or tail of. And then at the same time, speaking about, let's say, single parent households means that you must be a right-wing fanatic. How did we come to this today, where we can't speak about social issues without first being afraid to be labeled something?
Yes, I agree with everything that you've said, actually, Julian. You raise a number of different points. So you invoke Adolph Reed, whom I admire, have for a long time. I must say, I don't consider myself to be on the left. I'm afraid I'm too much of a neoliberal as an economist to feel comfortable with that designation. But I have great sympathy for the point that racial essentialism crowds out from a discussion of the inequality problems that involve African Americans, crowds out from that discussion a consideration of more fundamental dynamics. And so race is in and of itself not the causal engine that's driving the circumstances that one, food insecurity or homelessness or poverty or mass incarceration. The temptation to see race as the primary causal factor and then to invoke a crusade of anti-racism, this needs to be resisted. And I would have sympathy for resisting it through an analytical lens that put much more emphasis on class positioning and on economic structures. So I would say that. But I think there's and I have great sympathy for Adolph Reed, as I say, in part not only because he denounces this racial essentialism, but also because he lays bare, I think, in his work, the extent to which an interesting kind of class dynamic goes on within the advocacy community on behalf of racial equality. There's a kind of careerism. There is an organizational and personal investment in a certain set of narratives, a certain set of tropes that either rely on or are themselves embodying a kind of racial essentialism. The example about COVID, I think, is, and you see where it takes you, it starts with an observation of the disparity of the incidence of COVID morbidity and mortality. And it ends up in this headlong rush to be able to paint it as another instance of white supremacy and of anti-Black racism. It ends up embracing the very kind of biological essentialism that the people on the right of the far right in the political spectrum embrace. So that's one thing I want to say. I get a lot of value in my own thinking out of reading Rogers Brubaker, the sociologist at UCLA. There's a book, Ethnicity Without Groups, that I much admire. But the broader point about Brubaker is he makes us aware of the choice that we make in racial framing, in framing incidents in a particular sort of race heavy narrative. So I could give many examples of this, but I take the problem that really is the driving engine of Black Lives Matter, which is police brutality and excess force against Black civilians. I take that as a case in point, because when one sees a event, a police officer shoots a civilian, this is a problematic thing if the officer is doing so in excess of his legitimate authority and so forth. This is something that should be called to our attention. Is it a racial event? What makes it a racial event is the mere fact of the race of the police officer and the citizen in itself sufficient to cause us to construe the event as another manifestation of an age-old kind of American antipathy to Black bodies and Black lives and so forth and so on. And in fact, the fact of the matter is we needn't always so construe these events, and there are real reasons to worry about falling easily into the habit of seeing the detritus, the negative consequences of conflict in the maintenance of order in urban America, seeing those incidences entirely through a racial lens. So I said that you invoke Moynihan, you put a lot on the table, and true enough, he was vilified. Also not a man of the left, I think you would have to say, Moynihan, although he was he was a Democrat. But the family, the fact that there might be a cultural component, there are many unspeakable things. So the pressure on people to avoid touching on these sensitive matters, the deplatforming that goes on, all this, as you say, is a serious problem. And yes, it does have implications for the vocation of public intellectual practice. I mean, you do have to consider the consequences of taking up certain questions, of being pointed, of being honest, brutally honest about matters when convention is pushing in the other direction. You will be labeled, etc.
My thoughts, though, are that we've been hyper focused on race. The heritage of the United States. One of the ways I found out about slavery was my father broke our 1 hour a week rule of TV, and he insisted that we watch Roots. And so we were given this bizarre televised history, right? And all that problematically represents too. So Americans' version of slavery is Kunta Kinte, right? And Cicely Tyson and who else?
Why are we talking about slavery? Here we are in the year 2020.
Right.
Slavery in the United States ended at the end of the Civil War. That was more than 150 years ago. Why are we talking about slavery? What's the relevance of? I grant you that there is power in the historical narrative of African Americans' dispossession and then rising in protest and demonstration and demand to the country's recognition of, et cetera, et cetera. I grant you that, but slavery is not new in human experience. It is as horrible as it is. It's horrible as it is. It is very horrible. It's not. There's nothing new. There's nothing new in conquest, in genocide, and these things are a part of history. They're a part of the human experience.
But the thing that strikes me about
let me just say this, Julian. I just want to say this. There's value in the success, the story about the success of the abolition of slavery, at least within the United States. I grant you that it still goes on the planet in various forms. There's value in the nobility of the rise of African Americans from serfdom, because the Black population in the United States at the end of the Civil War were serfs. They were peasants to the condition of being the most prosperous and powerful people of African descent on the planet. There's some nobility even in the story of the making of citizens that took place over this long, dark night of Jim Crow, 100 years from the end of the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. But still, there's some remarkable sense of success and accomplishment and so on. So I don't know why we're still talking about slavery. Thank you for allowing me to say that, Julian.
No, this is great. I was raising this because when I came to the States, within the first year of my living in the States as a 10-year-old was Roots. Then my entire education from media about what African American participation in the United States was pretty much bent on the oppression narrative, which historically is true to that degree. Like you said, 150 years ago. And what about today? Or what about the great heritage since, even during Jim Crow? And we all know the positive history that exists, but somehow, and this has happened in other communities as well, because I write a lot about the problems of gender identity, where narratives of identity become chained to a very negative oppression that may or may not exist, or that has been refictionalized. And I'm wondering why. Why is it that we are caught up in, now the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century, and people are still rehashing an identity that's based on something that, even if historically true, has very little resonance to the present. Now, I know Black Lives Matter, that ethos would disagree with what I'm saying, and saying that the remnants of slavery are still with us today. I think that then would oversimplify the power of generations of time, of familial developments, community development, and political change that has besought, all of our societies, not just in the US, but if you look at Algerians in France or Senegalese in Belgium, etc. There have been so many changes such that I wonder why our entire encapsulation of identity for African Americans somehow must harken back to the most oppressed near history that we can come up with, to the same thing when it comes to identities of other sorts. I'm very critical of gender identity because It seems to function purely on stereotypes. And I've been thinking about this because what we're seeing, only because people want to have an identity, or because people are unable to evoke some of the problems of, let's say, policing. And you've spoken a lot to many of the other cases of police violence where, aside from Tamir Rice, if a white person is killed by the police, that becomes almost ignored. So we have a sort of distortion by the media that wants to explode certain types of, let's say, police violence or killings, and then to posture this as oppression. But when it's other sorts of actions that happen, other sorts of bodies, other values that are put into play, those are completely unrepresented. And although we can speak of racist acts, or we can speak of sexist acts, I have to wonder how in 2020, an entire nation moved to legitimize certain types of violence and then decry others. The media representation of the riots themselves, of the protests. Depending on what channel you watch, you got a very different version of what was going on, you see?
Yeah, I do see. That's, you've said a lot once again, and the last of it, I think, is very true. The depiction of the protests / riots was politicized, and the media are players in the perpetuating of a particular narrative. I think the selective outrage about the extirpation of Black lives, that if done by an officer of the state becomes a cause célèbre in a case for movement mobilization. But if occurring in the context of the, sort of daily violence that characterizes life in some quarters of Black America, then even if children are the victims, it becomes unspeakable to talk about it. And right. I think about the suffering, the pathos, the pain, the families for which these, where they're grieving the loss of these victims of internal violence within the community and not perpetrated by the state. And I don't know about how one should respond. I mean, maybe the political response, maybe the appropriate political response is to petition for, a more just society, a more social provision, greater social democracy and whatnot, and alleviation of the economic marginalization of this population. But somehow I think there should also be a normative, a values, kind of moral dimension to how can we live like this? What is the value of life if we take it in such a cavalier manner among ourselves? What's wrong with our community that we raise up adolescents who become so contemptuous of the value of life? What does it say about us that we live this way, and so on? And perhaps that's not a political, that's a communal and some kind of almost spiritual dimension of reflection and communication amongst the people of color, amongst Black people here in the United States, not something that would be the appropriate fare for speeches from politicians or edicts of government and so on. I don't know, but I want to say something else, if I may, Julian. This is about slavery. I mean, I'm still on my question about why is it such a, you say that the young protesters now would object if you were to poo-poo slavery and if you were to focus on other things, but why? And I think so much has changed in the last, even in the last 50 years. I mean, the transformation of law and culture and politics here in the United States, such that racism is it's not all gone, but it's a completely discredited, Barack Obama's presidency and so on. If you were to go back 50 years and look at the campaigns of George Wallace when he was, or something like that, you would see that, or even the Republican campaigns of Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan, the use of racial tropes. I mean, that kind of behavior, political behavior, would be completely unacceptable. So there's been change in that. We've got immigration, tens of millions of new people, citizens and members of the American political community have come from non-European points of origin in the 50 years since the civil rights movement. Globalization, the economic, we talked the rise of China and the shrinking of the world in terms of communication and the economic integration and whatnot, deindustrialization, technological, the tech revolution, everything is different. The country is complete. These are the realities that have to be grappled with. The evocation of slavery and the lapsing into this kind of romantic rhetoric where you generalize away from all the actual structural dynamics. I mean, you free float from history. So yeah, I have not answered your question about why we are in this condition, but I just wanted to add my 2 cents in terms of describing.
No, but I think it's great. Even the frustration over it, because I remember, All Lives Matter a few years ago, and I was like, okay, I get what they're saying. I don't understand why they're picking on people who won't parrot this, who rightfully also say, or Black Lives Matter, I'm sorry, the people who come back with All Lives Matter. And I'm okay, we're 2 sides of the same coin, right? And I just sort of let that go. I didn't give it much credence at the time.
Because they're exacting a loyalty oath. What they want is obeisance. They're asking you to affirm that you believe as they believe, that you see as they see. It's a test.
Well, this is exactly how it's so parallel to the transgender narrative, where if you're a woman and you don't say trans women are women, believe me, your inbox will be full of threats, especially if you're a writer. And there's public ideology in recent years has taken this turn that if you don't parrot the given agenda, you will be persona non grata very quickly. Your employer will be called up. You will be deplatformed from talks. Your editors will be contacted. This is what's going on for easily the last 8 years. And I don't think it's a very useful political tool, because really, if you want to get people on your platform, I'd say threatening them isn't a great way to go about it personally, or cajoling them into saying it, or else you'll call them a racist on major media. But it does also make me laugh in a way, because I'm thinking, this is what racism is. I mean, this is not racism, not parroting Black Lives Matter. That's just not racism. That's an ideological difference. We've seen Philadelphia Fire, a really great book. I think it was written in the late 80s. Beautifully talks about what went on in Philadelphia and the protests against the police and the attempt to bomb a block of the city,
Oh, I remember that very well. I remember that, yes.
Yeah, I mean, in Watts, you've spoken about Watts. I saw you speak about that a few weeks ago. I mean, these are like serious, these were serious issues. This was where racism actually was at the core. A lot of well-to-do, not just Black, but also white Americans, middle upper class Americans have been pushing the Black Lives Matter agenda, to the disgruntlement of many people who would like to be talking about class, poverty, right? And I'm wondering how we got to where the left in the States, they consider themselves the left, are pushing for identity and words to be parroted, rather than getting at some of the socioeconomic reforms that might be better suited over toppling statues, burning police buildings. Black Lives Matter is trying to push the idea that people are discriminated against because of the color of their skin, where a lot of the people who've created Black Lives Matter are very affluent African-American women.
Well, that's certainly true. And I was alluding to that a little bit in reference to Adolph Reed's putting his finger on the internal kind of class structure of the protest and advocacy community, movement dynamics, where careerism cuts in. And I mean, the leading spokespeople, the pundits, the people who write books, the people who give, I could name names, but I don't want to make it personal, lectures on college campuses on behalf of the anti-racism crusade, and are paid $20,000 and $30,000 and $50,000 a pop. You could go into that. I mean, I in the police violence context of Black Lives Matter, the state violence and whatnot, I'm struck by the fact that 1,200 or so people are killed by police in the United States every year. Most of them are white people.
Yeah.
They are in situations similar to the ones that have become national causes. You can find for every case of a George Floyd or Eric Garner or Michael Brown or whatever, you can find cases where whites have met their end at the hands of police in very similar circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So uh, the trend, I think, in the economic disparities, the literature on discrimination in wages and housing and so forth, it continues to report that there are some, adverse effects or differences that are not explained by other factors disadvantaging African Americans. There's still some discrimination, but the magnitude of that has gone down substantially. I think if you talk about incarceration and overrepresentation of African Americans, there again, there's some indication of discriminatory behavior disadvantaging blacks and prosecution of the war on drugs or sentencing behavior, but it doesn't account for the bulk of the disparity in overrepresentation of blacks in prison. Is not mainly, and on my argument, on my reading of the data, is not mainly a consequence of anti-black discrimination. Again, I'm not sure I'm being responsive to your question, Julian. You wanted something
No.
about that?
I was just curious if to your research on issues of class and police violence, even where, I mean, a lot of people are saying that the reason why George Floyd was killed, Breonna Taylor was killed, was because they were black. When you look into the cases, however, there's another story to be told. And not that, is there a litmus test for these officers, especially in some of the cases in the last 2 years, some of the officers have themselves been black and Hispanic and Filipino, etc. So
that's true.
What is the bar here?
And I don't know of any case, do you? I wonder of a highly educated, upper middle class African American who was the victim of one of these police shooting situations. I don't know quite what to make of that. If people like me, I have high income. I'm a upper middle class person. I'm professional person and whatnot. There is the story of the cop pulled me over while I was driving my BMW just because I'm black, driving while black. But that's kind of a urban legend. I mean, I don't know the extent to which the imposition of the police presence on the quality of life of African Americans very much penetrates into the upper middle class of the Black community. I think it's mainly a phenomenon that is seen in the working and lower classes communities of African American residents, and I think it's closely related to the problem of criminal participation and so on that occasions the police presence in the first place. I mean, that can be misinterpreted. What I just said is if I was justifying police brutality, and I
think you're saying though that the percentage of cases that come up in poor communities, whether or not they happen to be black or Latino or white,
that's correct.
But the police will be going more frequently to calls in those parts of town.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Race studies is something that has come under fire in recent months. The D'Angelo book, which I LOL'd while reading, I've never seen something so racist in my life, actually, in recent years, being called anti-racist. Speaking about George Wallace, that's like, citing Wallace as somehow a civil rights figure of importance. Because D'Angelo's book is everything to me, it represents everything that's wrong with this leftist push to re-nativize racism. There's this almost noble savage kind of move happening, where instead of what was in the 70s, my best friend is black kind of move, we're seeing, well, you're not worthy of speaking because of the color of your skin. Let Charles, who's black, speak. So D'Angelo's book basically takes all of racist discourse from history and flips it and says, if you're white, you just shut up and sit at the back of the room. And it's really one of those you laugh or you cry, that this has been adopted by consultants, by some cities, some
well, these books, you might have mentioned Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. I mean, these books have sat for many weeks on the bestsellers list at the New York Times and other places. They have been imbibed by and become vital to the thinking of large numbers of white Americans. I think one has to explain that. But where does the hunger for this kind of, you call it racist, I would be inclined to agree. It essentializes whiteness. All white people are the same somehow. Race becomes the center of everything. I agree. But why should whites so eagerly embrace, so many whites so eagerly embrace this narrative?
To me, it is a type of pseudo-religiosity of the left that's pushed away all forms of religion for decades. But their religion that has now been fully cemented around this kind of confessional. You talked about guilty while driving while black. This is guilt while being white, you know. So now people, I saw that photo, a woman kneeling to apologize for slavery. I laughed out loud when I saw that. It was on Twitter, I think. Why are people apologizing for something that we literally have nothing to do with? None of us, you, me, you know, this is.
Well, they're supposedly inheriting some privilege unearned in virtue of the color of their skin. And the fact that slavery was a racial institution. So it somehow elevated whiteness. I guess an argument can be made, the denigration of the African, which was a necessary thing in US political culture, given that slavery was a part of the package when the country was founded, and yet the ideals of the founding emphasized liberty and the value of the individual. You have to then see the subject of the slave commerce as less than fully human person in order to justify your political regime along with your economic regime of enslavement. So there's a pushing down of the black, and I guess that then is a kind of valorization or honoring of the white. And I think you look at the assimilation dynamic over the course of 100 years, from let's say 1880 to 1980, where you've got wave after wave. I mean, the Irish were coming, Italian, the Slavs, the Jews, you've got wave after wave, tens of millions of immigrants coming to the country, and they are not white when they arrive, but they become white in the fullness of time, by the time you get to the mid 20th century. And then, so this is a story about the construction of whiteness. I guess you have to live in that kind of mindset in order to then be able to point to somebody walking on the streets of New York City in 2020 who happens to be of Caucasian ethnicity, and you say of them they are white, and you link them somehow to the historical depredations of slavery to such an extent that they then feel the need to apologize for something. I don't know. It's a very odd way of thinking about society. I mean, these intergenerational inheritances of responsibility and of guilt and of entitlement. A black person walking around the day who points to the suffering of distant slave ancestors and then turns to society and extends their hand and says, pay me for what? Did I somehow inherited the debt? You didn't give 40 acres and a mule to my ancient slave ancestors. I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I'll stop in a moment, Julian. Most progressives think the inheritance tax is perfectly justifiable. And they say to the wealthy people who insist that they should be able to convey across generations the benefits of their own life success, keep your hands off of my wealth, I want to give it to my son. That's what, and they say to those people, no, no, your claims of intergenerational entitlement are not absolute in a society such as we live in. And yet, the very logic of my ancestors were enslaved, you owe me, depends upon a kind of intergenerational inheritance, property right entitlement claim that's not so dissimilar to the person who owns a farm who wants to be able to leave it intact to their offspring and not have it broken up by estate taxation would make.
That's a very good
It's
point.
ironic. It's ironic.
No, it's true, because that argument's often made by people on the left, and that is a contradiction in that term. The events of the summer made me think about how, as a country, we are hyper conscious of race, and made to be so in large part because when you go to the university, especially since the late 80s, there's been a whole host of humanities studies to teach us about that. Now, this raises an issue, of course, because race does not exist amongst humans. And Darwin discusses this to great ridicule of his enemies at the time in The Origin of Species. Race had become a new thing in the early part of the 21st century, when we learned well over 150 years ago that race does not exist amongst humans. But here we are re-invoking race. And why do you think that people are so keen to hold on to an identity as race on the left now? This isn't George Wallace anymore. This is the neoliberal left and further afloat.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, Julian. I do affirm that the developments in the universities would surely be an important part of the story that you'd want to tell here. These are ideas that we're talking about after all. And the transformation of the humanities, I mean, I hear this from my colleagues. I am a social scientist, not a humanist myself, but I'm paying attention to what's going on in history, what's going on in literary studies, what's going on in the ethnic studies world, the influence, and again, I speak now as an outsider to the humanities, of relativist and postmodernist kinds of thinking, and the kind of critical theory, critical studies dimension, the deconstruction, the exposing of the hidden hand of oppression and domination, and the voices, the idea that one has to hear not only from dead white males, anti-patriarchal and anti-white supremacists, decolonizing these themes seem to resonate very powerfully in the humanities and in some areas of the social sciences, certainly in anthropology, I think one would have to say, maybe to a lesser degree in sociology. So things are going on, and I'm just a humble economist over here. I'm not a cultural historian. It seems you need a big sweeping view to fully grasp what's happening.
One thing I am noticing in the last 15 years, some of even my former students from New York and elsewhere, they are not able to afford the lifestyle of their parents. And I do wonder if this has to do with the left's lack of material power. Therefore, the surrogate to that is the only thing that they can have for free, which is language. So you call me as I tell you to call me. You parrot my political diatribe, or else.
Oh, I like this. I've thought similar things myself. That you mentioned the statute debate. And I thought these are the arguments of the weak. These are the arguments of the powerless. This is a tantrum that's being thrown here. That this is someone who actually can't control. They have no capital, and they have no real political power. They man no armies. They don't win majorities at the polls, but they can throw a tantrum. And so they insist on this or that piece of etiquette, this or that affirmation of their view. If working class based unions still determined who was the Democratic nominee for president, Democratic Party nominee for president, And if the issues of, I don't know, control over corporate power or the nature of working conditions and whatnot, the sharing of the surplus from a successful enterprise between labor and capital. If those were the forefront issues, there'd be no room and no need for the mobilization of people's enthusiasms based on their identitarian associations. It's only in the absence of a movement, as it were. This is all caps movement, and by which I mean a serious political confrontation with the underlying structures of economic and political power. In the absence of a movement with all caps, we have a movement in lowercase, or a set of movements in lowercase, which are these effusions of identity-fueled demands. They issue demands. There's an insistence. And it's a faux politics. It's not a resonant politics. It invites patronization. You're being placated when the powers that be accede to your stature-removing demands. They are merely tamping down your tantrum. They're not really ceding any power.
You're listening to Savage Minds. If you like this and our other podcasts, as well as our articles and essays, please consider getting a paid subscription. Now, back to our show.
It was very interesting to me this summer to see, side by side, the protests over George Floyd and then what's called the Karen incident in Central Park. And the reason why this struck me is because there was a great op-ed, and I can't remember his name, I think it was in the New York Post, where the writer accused Chris Cooper, I'm sorry, this cracked me up, of being the real Karen. He wrote, well, the real Karen here is Chris Cooper, because he's the one that goes into the park and is being all what the British would call jobsworth about the rules. And, her behavior was atrocious, but he went out to set up and make her follow the rules. So you had sort of a power head. Meanwhile, everyone was saying, oh, but look at George Floyd. And a lot of us were like, well, hey, this guy did not get the treatment of George Floyd. Do we know that's what her goal was? It was a very cheap assault from the Amy Cooper side of it. But I found it quite interesting how the media was running over itself to make a parallel between that incident and George Floyd. There was no parallel to be made. In fact, it was all very media concocted, including Chris Cooper sending the information to his sister who was in Hollywood, who then had a larger Twitter population to feed it to, right?
So I did not know that, but yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah, I found it all very, wow, this is well done, bravo. It was well orchestrated. And not that I think Amy Cooper, behaved well at all, but there were all these issues coming up in feminist groups that I was in. And they were like, well, if I'm a woman in a park and a guy starts coming up to me threatening to do something that I'm not going to like, I'm going to freak out. And you couldn't discuss that, of course, because where racism and sexism are standing next to each other, the racism will trump the sexism in this discussion, as I found out in Facebook groups. And at the end of all the discussions with various women, you just resigned yourself to shut up. Again, the self-censorship that goes on in this era, where you're afraid to speak out because then someone will call you a Karen. It's also tautological. So
yeah, I mean, I chuckle here a little bit because, well, what was the offense? See, the offense was that this black guy who just was out he's a birder. So this is already contra the stereotype. He's an African-American, he's out early in the morning, and right. he has his field glasses, and he's a birder. And he's presumed to be a threat to this woman who invokes her racial authority. This is the narrative that right. I'll call the cops on you. Even though he is this innocent guy who's just out there watching birds. Now, right. What's the reality? Now, of all of the encounters that occur in New York City, across racial lines, how many of them are of that quality where Karen is lording her presumed racial authority over a guy who's been profiled as a threat and is really just a aesthetic lover of nature. How many are
Yeah.
versus how many are like a mugger or a potential mugger or a miscreant menacing a person who's black, causing fear, justified fear, and a concern amongst a person who might be white who encounters them in Central Park. What's the relative number, the relative incidence of those two types, of those two ideal types of encounters between people? Well, the latter is more likely the case. So one of the reasons I'm trying now to answer your question about why we get caught up in the kind of social media fueled hysteria around racial incidents as we do, as the Chris Cooper incident was. One of the answers, I think, is it's a counterweight to the unspoken but much more overpoweringly, empirically resonant reality, which is the antisocial and uncivil behavior of so many who are black in the urban spaces encountering white people. That's the unspoken part of this whole thing. And one of my concerns about why our obsession with race is that how long can the unspoken remain unspoken? That is, how long can you talk about white offenses against poor, innocent black people who are being preyed upon or wrongly accused without also beginning in the fullness of time to talk about white people who are offended against by blacks who are acting uncivilly? I mean, look at the robbery statistics. The mugging, the prototypical mugging is not an innocent black person being preyed upon by a white person. It's exactly the opposite. And there are many, many, many tens of thousands of those events occurring in the United States on an annual basis. So beware racializing discourses about civil order and crime, because if you take the covers off of what is supposed not to be spoken of, you're going to get a very reactionary kind of situation.
Well, the New York Post piece on the Coopers, I rather like that they have the same name, dealt with the fact that it gave the backstory, something I did not know about, and I've lived in New York a long time, but it was about the birder culture and the ongoing war between birders and dog owners. I had no clue, but it's a thing. And he gives a very good history about this. And then that's when he comes down to, well, Chris Cooper knew the dynamic as an avid birder, and he took it upon himself to be the ultimate Amy. I'll send you the article. It's extremely funny, very well done. But it made me think a lot about the dynamics of power at play, especially since Chris Cooper, two words of his mouth, you're like, this guy's definitely the last person to be on the front page because the police shot him. Not that it would never happen, but he really, you could tell the man is highly educated. And in the United States, as in most countries of the world, education is everything. And that's what I feel like is missing from the Black Lives Matter discussion. One of the leaders of Black Lives Matter has actually given a lecture at a think tank with very strong links to the Department of Defense. But they've all been dealing with loads of donations, and where the monies for their donations are going, no one seems to understand how this is actually going to make Black Lives Matter more. And these are very serious questions that they should be answering too, because since the Black Lives Matter hashtag went viral in the summer, everyone from Microsoft to Apple to Google, they've been checking out tens of millions of dollars.
I hope someone's following that money.
I do too.
It's a brand that has become a thing unto itself, and so then it can serve as this vehicle for, the brand management of large corporate entities. You say Apple or Nike or whatever. I don't know what these corporations are doing, but I do hear that they're doing quite a bit. by funneling money. So then what happens to the money, and who is actually benefiting at the end of the day becomes an important question. But they stand in for something. They are an idea as well as an organization.
Well, some of these the money has also gone for the kind of training that D'Angelo offers. See, this is the problem: is when your race consciousness training begins and ends with, okay, whoever's white, you get to stand over there. Wait, that sounds to me like a lesson in racism, not in.
I agree with that, and this should be pushed back against. I don't understand why a participant in such a training can't object and demand that it be justified that you classify people preemptively in terms of their race. What do you mean by white? Where do you get off in a racial training, arrogating to yourself the right to designate people in this crude kind of binary categorization? It should be challenged.
Yes, and certainly the way that we respond to certain kinds of our culture is also caught up in stereotype. Like, I remember reading the biography of Miles Davis and learning that he came from a very affluent family from, I believe, Missouri, St. Louis. And his father was a dentist. And all of the myths surrounding jazz musicians were exploded with him right there. Or the fact that, the Russian poet, Pushkin, the Russians, I think when you start to study Pushkin, you find out that he has African heritage. But Russians don't run around saying our African Russian poet, right? And it's something that is very part of the United States. It's become a bit part of Canadian academic culture as well. So you'll see the line, Canadian African or Latino Canadian and Arab Canadian. And we've really fallen in love in Anglophone countries, especially with that line that divides this forced hybridity. Yet, go south of Texas, and throughout all of Latin America, you have the mestizaje, the Creole culture that's part and parcel.
Maybe Julian, excuse me for cutting in that. Maybe there's something too. You made a point about the identity dimension getting elevated in the absence of the economic power, and so, or maybe it was I who made the point, but it's the point about if unions are down, then identity politics is up because people basically don't have a way of trying to press their claims. But it strikes me that if nationalism is down, maybe identity politics is also to some degree up. I mean, you're pointing out this hyphenated phenomenon, of a certain kind of Canadian, a certain kind of American, where you have the Hispanic or the Latino, or you have the Black or the of color. There's this kind of emphasis on identity. And it strikes me that the phenomenon of nationalism, I mean, American Canadianness, asserting the nation's interest, kind of transcending the particularisms and on behalf of the corporate or collective enterprise, which is the nation. And it may be that the nation has blood on its hands. It may be that the nation, fought wars in the case of the United States that it ought not to have fought, or is understood through the lens of a 1619 project. That's the thing at the New York Times as being rooted in, dripping in the kind of guilt, the association with slavery and whatnot. It may be that the nation becomes harder to advocate for, and the harder it is, maybe that you elect a demagogue, a Donald Trump as president, and it becomes hard to be an American in an unself-conscious way. It may be that as the power of national idea goes down, then the space created for a flourishing of subnational identities comes into being, something like that.
Well, it's interesting because the funny part about watching the end of this presidential race, I was quite surprised when 2 days ago I flipped on the internet to Fox News and found their coverage more rational and objective than like CNN or MSNBC, and I was a bit flipped out. And I wrote this on my Facebook wall, and few people I know on the left said, yeah, I've been following them since the last presidential election because their coverage was saner. And it was remarkably saner, which surprised me. I understand why this guy is liked by people, even if I don't agree with most of the things he says.
Yeah.
He's very brazen in how he speaks. He speaks popular jargon. He does not try to tidy it up and sound academic at all. And people like that. Aside from the fact that in 1 minute, he's making a horrible imitation of a Chinese accent. And in the next minute, saying, I like my Latino friends. And it sounds horrible, right? But it resonates with people. So meanwhile, MSNBC is shocked that Latino voters have favored him in Florida. And I'm thinking, well, of course they have. Because for the last more than 4 years, all you've done is shame people that like him. Of course, the exit polls aren't going to resonate with what's really happening because people are afraid.
I agree with this. I just want to say I interviewed a man, John Shields is his name, at my podcast, The Glenn Show. I interviewed John Shields. He's a political science professor at Claremont McKenna College in Southern California. His book is called Trump's Democrats, and it's based on ethnography. He and his wife interviewed voters in 3 towns, one in industrial or post-industrial town in Iowa, one in Appalachia, and one in just outside of Providence, Rhode Island here on the East Coast. They're all working class white enclaves, and they all went for Obama twice heavily. One of them, in fact, had been going for Democrats for president since Franklin Roosevelt or something. I mean, they're very, very traditional Democratic constituencies, but they went for Trump. And he wanted to understand why, so he goes out and he talks to them. And the bottom line is, he's one of us. He's like one of us. Okay, he is plain spoken. He is a tough guy. He fights back. There was a kind of masculine or kind of macho dimension to it. He talks about honor culture. Anyway, he went to 3 working class white counties in America, one in Iowa, an industrial town, heavily unionized, but in decline because of deindustrialization. One in Appalachia, very poor, very white, very insular kind of political culture there. And one on the East Coast, Johnston, Rhode Island, just outside of Providence, where there's also a tradition of machine politics, kind of Irish, Italian, ethnic Democrat machine politics. And these are all counties that went heavily for Democrats for many, many years and voted for Obama twice, but then flipped and voted for Trump in 2016. He wanted to try to understand why. And the bottom line on that was merely to affirm something that you had been saying about finding it explicable as you listen to Trump speak about why it is that people might appeal to him, that he was plain spoken. He came across as one of them. He embodied certain kinds of masculine virtues that, of course, we sophisticated elites know is patriarchal, and we would never, affirm the attractiveness of them. But for many people, this is a toughness. This is a giving as good as you get. This is a kind of swagger. This kind of thing. So that anyway, I just wanted to add that to our discussion.
During lockdown, I remember seeing this interview with Pelosi standing in front of a refrigerator that cost, I'm sure, at least $15,000, eating frozen ice cream that probably cost $5 each. We're talking, she does not speak to the people like this. And that's where Trump wins. He can even be in a Rolls Royce. The way he speaks gets right to the heart of the issue. And regardless of his wealth, regardless of how many taxes he did or did not pay, he resonates with people who are struggling. We're talking via Zoom, lockdown, world travel is stalled. And there's a lot of social commentary the last decade about how social media is distancing us, but we're now being distanced by force of this virus. Now I have to wonder if the focus on race, on gender identity, and all these identities, a move away from talking about poverty, class issues that it seems the Republicans are heading towards, is being exacerbated by online life. We spoke briefly about how millennials very likely are going to be facing a lifetime of struggling to get work in the field they studied. I think very soon we'll be seeing more and more people who opt out of going to university for fear of not being able to get out of student debt. So I'm wondering how you view the use of, let's say, social media, the internet, and how this contributes to negatively or positively discussions about race in America and identity as a race. You know, this kind of fetish that's happening, where everyone is now being told they have to stand up for X identity, where
I can say for my own practice that I'm a university professor. I teach, I give lectures, I travel and give speeches. I do feel something very fundamental is happening. So my university is now, every class must be available for remote participation, and no instructor is required to be present on campus to offer the class. There is a campus, some students are there, some are not. Some professors are coming on the campus and with appropriate safety measures and distancing and masking and testing are resuming in-person interaction with students. But if I didn't want to go to my office, I would not be required to go to my office, and I would do all of my teaching in this way. And it strikes me that what that does, as it has become now a widespread practice, is it separates the physical location of the campus and the facilities there from the intellectual offerings of the lectures and instruction and the teaching and so on. And I don't see how, once that genie is out of the bottle, if we are normalizing that practice, that doesn't completely transform the higher education industry and make it possible, for example, for a person like myself to offer my classes to 1 million people. And not just to 200 who can fit inside of an auditorium. If 1 million people were to want to subscribe to the services that I would offer. And if I were able to give lectures or lead people through the reading of a certain literature or teach them certain basic techniques and ways of thinking and whatnot, or, with people in the tens and tens of thousands who would decide to subscribe to my platform and pay the fees necessary to have access to my content, I could be a force unto myself. I don't mean to personalize this. I mean, any prominent and effective communicator with mastery over material that was of interest to a wide audience would be able to place themselves in the position of crowding out the local provider of the same kind of intellectual content at a physical campus somewhere. I don't know why people would subscribe. I mean, it's a little bit like if the only opera that you could hear performed, you would have to be present in an opera house to hear it. Then there would be opera lovers, and the opera houses of great quality would be overflowing with subscribers, and they'd have a full audience. But they are the only people who would actually be hearing the opera. Once it becomes possible to reproduce the performance of the opera on a high fidelity electronic system so that people can buy CDs or they can stream the content or whatever, suddenly the audience for opera becomes much, much greater than the aficionado who subscribes to the city's opera house. And it becomes something that can be indulged by people in the 10 or 100 times the numbers that would be you could fit into opera houses. And it feels to me a bit like what the Zoom conveyed, kind of virtual, the advent of that as a way to conduct the business of the university. It feels to me a little bit like it's opening up to the possibility of a much wider competitive climate.